back to my channel. So before I dive right on into today's incredibly bizarre case, I want to remind you guys that John Lorden and I's podcast, Crime After Crime, released the very first episode today. So I'm not exactly 100% sure at this moment when exactly we plan on releasing it. We haven't talked about that exact hour or time yet, but knowing John and I, it'll probably have been released already first thing this morning, so don't forget to go out and show your support. You guys, we are so incredibly excited about this podcast, and if you're interested to know what the very first podcast was about, we each had the task of finding the most bizarre weapon used in a crime, and we battled it out in podcast form to see who brought the best, craziest story. We talked about some of our own personal situations when it came to bizarre crimes, and overall it was just a really awesome podcast, and it's something that we are both very proud of, and you get to see a very different, more laid-back version of John and I think you guys are really going to love it. So definitely go and show it some love. It's going to be anywhere where you can get your favorite podcast. So don't forget to go and subscribe to that, as well as subscribe to the Crime After Crime YouTube channel. I think the only place we still haven't been qualified for yet is Spotify, and I've said that for like the past 3 videos. They're taking forever, but you should be able to get us anywhere else. So now to dive right into this insane case. Now, I've looked into this case quite a few times over the past year, very briefly, like skimmed through the Wikipedia page just to get an idea of it. And when I really dug deeper into it, I was shocked that not many people have covered this case. And that is the case of Amy Wroe Bechtel, because this case is charged and just dripping with theories and accusations and, you know, people that really haven't done themselves a favor when it comes to looking suspicious. So Amy was 24 years old when she disappeared in Lander, Wyoming on July 24th of 1997. Amy lived a seemingly perfect and relaxed life. She grew up as the youngest of 4, and she was very, very close to her siblings and her parents, because you think 1997 and growing up in the 80s and 90s, you don't have all these social media distractions like we do now, and everyone just went outside and hung out, and you had a lot better face-to-face relationships, and that's just how they grew up, and their bond as a family was so strong, to the point where even when her brother got married, without a question in his mind, his 3 best men were his 3 sisters. Amy, though, was a pretty shy person, and I don't necessarily think that it's so much shy as it is. She was just very concentrated on herself, and she was very goal-driven, and she had a plan in place for herself. But despite being kind of shy, I guess, and a little more reserved, she was incredibly outspoken. She always said what was on her mind. If she had an issue, she immediately got it out. She wasn't the kind of person that beat around the bush and held on to problems that she had or things that she felt needed to get off her chest. She was always one to come out and say it. She just was the kind of person that knew what she wanted, knew how to get it, knew how to be happy, took charge of her life, and that really started showing in high school. So Amy, as I said, was very goal-driven, and at high school, one of her friends came up to her, and her friend's dad was actually the track coach. And somehow this friend convinced Amy to join the track team. And Amy had never been a huge fan of running. Honestly, I don't think many people are, me especially, but I could just be speaking for myself. But Amy was not the fastest. It wasn't something she was naturally skilled at, but this is where her personality really shines. So whenever Amy was confronted with something like this, she didn't back down from it. Just like she didn't back down from, you know, telling someone how she really felt, she always took the challenge head on and surpassed expectations and went past everything. And that's exactly what she planned to do with track. So she started out as the slowest. She wasn't very great at it, but by the end of her high school career, she was running in competitions as one of the fastest. Amy went on to graduate from the University of Wyoming, where she continued her running career, and she just got better and better, to the point where she was considering trying out for the Summer Olympics in the year 2000. Now, to go from the slowest runner 2 years later, wanting to try out for the Olympics, that right there is the epitome of Amy as a person. She always got to that end goal, and it was always the wildest end goal in the entire world, but she somehow always achieved it. But she also had another huge passion and importance in her life in college, and that was a man named Steve Bechtel. And I'm sure you're hearing the last name, so you're already guessing where this is going. But she met Steve in college and they hit it off right off the bat. He was very outdoorsy. He was a very physical person, you know, physically active and fit, and he liked to rock climb and he liked to be outside and adventure and explore. And that's exactly the kind of person that she wanted to be with. So shortly after college, Steve and Amy got married and ended up moving to Lander, Wyoming to start off their life together. And Lander was a perfect place for them. Lander is known by the locals to be this hidden gem that everybody is missing out on, because the entire town is filled with outdoorsmen. I'm talking they hunt, they fish, they rock climb, they mountain climb, they kayak, they run. I mean, anything you could possibly think of, the entire town's heart just beat for it. And Steve was really fond of rock climbing, and in Lander there was a great, really tight-knit group of rock climbers, and some of the best rock climbers lived here, and they immediately took Steve and Amy under their wing. I think one of the rock climbers there actually rented the house that Amy and Steve stayed in, so it was just a great place for them to be. It seemed like they were living their best life, because both of them were working part-time at I think just like a sports shop. I think it was maybe centered around rock climbing, but they were only working part-time there, each of them. They had plenty of days off. They had plenty of time to continue their passions. Even their place of work was, you know, them surrounded by rock climbing and outdoor activities and things that they loved. I think Amy worked part-time a while at a restaurant, and they were just submerged in this lifestyle that they both loved and enjoyed. 3 days before Amy vanished, they even bought their first house. So at the age of 24, man, they were living the dream. It's like things couldn't be more perfect, and they were so ready to start this next step in their life until that chance was taken. So the morning of July 24th, Amy headed out for a very busy day. Both Amy and Steve had the day off, so they had already packed their schedule top to bottom. They were not the kind of people to just sit around. So Steve decided to go off with a friend named Sam Leitner to Du Bois, Wyoming, about 70 miles away from their home, to check out this rock wall that they had had their eye on and wanted to climb for such a long time. And this particular location they were going to, they kind of jokingly referred to as the place where all the national parks dumped their bears. It was known as a pretty dangerous place. There was a lot of wildlife, tons of bears, so they each brought a gun with them. I think they brought a dog with them, and they packed up in separate cars and headed out to Du Bois sometime in the morning. I have not been able to find an exact time. I just know sometime that morning they left. And Amy decided to stay behind, and she was going to take care of all the new, not so exciting / kind of exciting things for when you buy a house. So she was calling and starting up electricity. She was setting up a phone line. And once she was done with that, around 9:30 in the morning, she headed off to teach a children's weightlifting class at the Wind River Fitness Center. This is something that she had already promised she would do, and again, why not work when you're doing something you love? She planned on going to that, teaching this class, and then she was going to run a few errands, and then if she had time, she was going to go for a run in Shoshone National Forest, where she was planning a 10K. So the day goes on as normal, and at around 4 to 4:30 p.m., Steve gets back home from this climb with his friend, and they had checked the entire place out. The rock wall totally was not climbable. They were disappointed, but you know, it was worth going to check. And when he got home, Amy wasn't there. And at first, Steve wasn't too alarmed with this, because he knew Amy had a busy day. He knew she had lots of errands to run and places that she wanted to go. He knew that she possibly wanted to go on a run later, so he just decided to give her a little bit of time. But after a few hours and she didn't come home and hadn't contacted him, he started to get a little bit worried. So according to Steve and Amy's mom, she always contacted you saying where she would be at, if she would be running late, when she would be home. Now, it is is 1997, so I am unsure if she had a cell phone. Cell phones did exist then, but they were not common at all for people to really have. So I'm not sure if they kind of expected her to call from a payphone or maybe a business or something, or if she did have a cell phone and no one just mentioned it. But either way, she hadn't contacted him. So he decided to call her family because he thought, you know, what could be a reason she wouldn't be home? He was going over all the bases and they were moving soon. And he wondered if maybe she drove 175 miles away to her parents' house to pick up some furniture. So he hit dial on the phone, and when he told them about it, they hadn't seen her either. So around this same time, at around 7 p.m., the Skinners, two of their friends, stopped by Amy and Steve's house to ask them if they wanted to go to the movies. And obviously, they got there to find Steve a little upset and worried. And they asked him what was going on, and he said, you know, Amy went out today, she ran all these errands, she might have gone running, and she hasn't come back home, and I haven't heard from her. And he told them, you know, don't be too worried, go watch a movie. I'm gonna stay here and hope that she shows up. So time passes and the movie's over, and the Skinners decide to stop by the house to make sure Amy made it back home safe. But they return to the house to something they weren't exactly expecting. Steve was in, at this point, according to them, a full-blown panic. Amy hadn't come home. I think at this point, it's safe to assume it's around 9:30, 10 o'clock, and she'd been gone all day, and she would never be gone this late and not come back or call somebody. So the Skinners immediately said they needed to go and search for her. And Steve told them, you know what, please do go out and look for her. Let me know if you find her. But he was very persistent that he stayed home and waited for her in case she came back, and so he could call authorities and report her missing if she didn't. So by 10:30 that night, Amy was reported a missing person. And around this time, the couple had started to drive around Loop Road at Shoshone National Forest when something started to show up in their headlights. And the closer they got, they realized that Amy's white Toyota was parked at a turnout in Burton Gulch. They immediately jumped out of the car thinking, you know, maybe she's here and her car battery is dead or something is wrong. Is she in the car? Did she get lost somewhere? Did she hurt herself? And when they got to the car, they found it empty and unlocked. Now, I will say this area in general was known as a pretty safe area, and everyone in the neighborhoods didn't even lock their doors. So I don't think it's necessarily that massive of a thing that her car was unlocked. So just keep that in mind. Obviously it could play a part in this, but they went through the car to see if they found any clues, and on the passenger side seat they found a pair of Amy's sunglasses, they found her to-do list, and her car keys. So at this point, the only things known to be missing from the car were Amy and her wallet. They immediately got in contact with Steve to tell him that they had found Amy's car, but she was nowhere to be found. And he, again, went into a total panic, and he got a friend to come over. They started throwing flashlights and lanterns and food supplies and sleeping bags and everything possible in the car because they were planning on spending the night in Shoshone National Forest looking for Amy, because at this point they really believed something just happened to her out on her run. The friends decided to inspect the car a little closer, and it definitely wasn't just parked right there. It had been there for a while because it had rained that day, and there were puddles of mud underneath the car, but there weren't any tire tracks, there weren't any footprints, so it's almost like she showed up there before the rain, parked her car, went on a run, and never came back. So Steve calls all of her family and more friends to come out and help aid in the search, and he heads out there, and everyone at this point really did just believe it was just a matter of getting to her, to finding where she was hurt. You know, again, it's Shoshone National Forest. There are bears, there are mountain lions, there's all sorts of wildlife that could have potentially attacked her. But a few hours into their search, after screaming Amy's name over and over again with absolutely no response and miles covered, they started to wonder if this was something more sinister than they had originally thought. Friends and family searched all throughout the night, and by daybreak, authorities arrived on the scene and a full-blown search started. They brought in dogs, they brought in men on horseback, they had very specialized mountaineers and rock climbers, they had ATVs, they had heat sensing equipment on helicopters. This is just, you know, potentially 12 hours after she vanished, so they expected to get some sort of hit on where she possibly could have been. Everyone in this town was a professional in some sort of outdoor activity. There wasn't a single place on that mountain that they didn't have some person that was incredibly skilled and could get into that area. Authorities started to see if maybe there was some sort of hint anywhere that could lead them to the running route that she might have taken, and sure enough, when they looked on her to-do list, at the very bottom, they found a massive, massive clue. As I said before, she had been planning a 10K for the next couple of months, and she was trying to map out a route that she wanted all the runners to go. And a 10K is just a little over 6 miles, and where she wanted it to start was kind of near where her car was found, and the end would be at Fry Lake, again, a little over 6 miles away. So on the bottom of her to-do list, she had put down mile markers and land markers indicating where she wanted to run for this entire race. So to them, this is potentially a map that leads straight to her. And if she had gotten hurt, if she had broken her ankle and fallen, if she was stranded out there after being attacked by an animal, they were so positive at this point they were going to find her. But after searching every single one of these areas on her map, no clothing, no blood, and absolutely no sign of struggle or Amy was found. It was a 20 to 30 square mile search, and it's almost as if she had been plucked right off of the land. So authorities really started questioning their theory and what was happening here, because the idea of her being lost and hurt anymore was gone, because they searched so much area that they would have found her. If you're not familiar with a grid search, I mean, you walk up this way, take 2 steps that way, and walk back down this way pretty much. And obviously they do it with different measurements, but there's not a spot that you're not covered. You weave this way and then you weave that way. Like, there is not a spot that they missed. If there had been an attack, blood would have been somewhere. If she had been taken, sign of a struggle surely would have been found somewhere. But for there to be nothing, this definitely was no longer just a missing persons case. 5 days into the search for Amy, her case was switched from a missing persons case to a criminal investigation. But at this point, any potential crime scene in that area had been completely compromised. Amy's friends, when they had arrived, had gone through her entire car, and authorities even let them drive it home, because at this point, not a single person genuinely felt like something had happened in the sense of foul play. They really didn't think it. Dozens of cars had driven up the same road, so if there were any tire marks there, they were now long muddied by dozens of others. And hundreds of people had been searching the entire mountainside looking for her. So all these different areas where there potentially could have been evidence, it was all completely compromised, and they had nothing. 25 FBI agents quickly arrived in Lander to help create a list of who might have wanted to do something to her, and who might have seen her last, what her whereabouts were that day before she disappeared. And while they were frantically trying to make up for all of this lost time and ruined evidence, her family was putting up yellow ribbons around the entire town and putting up as many posters as they possibly could. Authorities finally were able to nail down exactly what she did that day, but I don't know how much it necessarily helped the case. So Amy taught the weightlifting class, and at around 2:30 it finished up and she headed to a place called Camera Connection. She was only there for about 5 to 15 minutes maybe. She was participating in some sort of photo contest and needed to enter a picture she had taken, and I think she needed copies of it and a picture frame and all these things. But the person who was there didn't really say there was anything unusual about her. She didn't look like she had already been on a run, but it more so looked like she was about to go on a run, which does match up with the events that they believed happened that day. But she didn't appear anxious, she didn't appear nervous. Her running away definitely was kind of ruled out at that point. So the next thing I'm going to get into is kind of a bit of information that I personally cannot substantiate. I don't know where it came from, but I feel like it could be important enough to still add it. Just keep in mind that this piece of information that I'm about to give you, I did see on at least 10 different articles about Amy, and there's potentially many more out there. I didn't see this on the Charlie Project, I didn't see it on the Disappeared episode, so I'm not sure if maybe this was just a rumor that circulated, and that's why it's out there, but I do want to mention it just for obvious reasons when I get into it. So it is also possible, according to some sources, that she then went to a place called Gallery 331 and spoke to the owner, Greg Wagner. And according to all these sources, Greg is the last person to have seen her, which is kind of what makes me question everything, because I feel like if he was disappeared at some of these larger places would be mentioning it. But according to him, I guess she seemed a little hurried and anxious and kept checking her watch. Now, this is kind of a prime example of being careful about the information you look into and believe when it comes to missing persons cases. This very easily could have been thrown in there to create some wow factor and to create more mystery behind something. And as sick as it is, some people genuinely enjoy mysteries. You know, that's why we're here. However, it's never beneficial to add more mystery that you've made up into something that is someone's life. So please go out and obviously do your own research. I just felt it was important to still mention it because A, it could be a complete false bit of information, and B, if it's not, it could also be the last time she was seen. So that's just something that I wanted to throw out there. But after this, authorities believe she headed straight to the national park for her run. She made it clear that if she finished all of her errands that day, she wanted to get this run in. She really wanted to map out this 10K. And they knew her car was found in this location, but that didn't confirm that Amy was the one who got it there, especially because it was now a criminal investigation. They wanted to make sure that no one just drove it out there because they didn't want to waste their time searching in an area that she never actually was. And if someone had taken her, it's very possible they knew exactly where these landmarkers were on the sheet of paper that her to-do list was on, and they easily could have driven out there, parked the car, thrown the keys in to make it look like Amy, and ran. And unfortunately, no one would be able to know because the car had been tampered with and not treated as a crime scene. So they decided to make a plea to the public to see if anyone in that area saw Amy that day. And sure enough, there were a few witnesses that came forward. I'm pretty sure it was at least 2 people. And both people claimed to see her running along Loop Road that day at around the same time. And one man in particular claimed to have seen her while going up to, I think, fix something somewhere. I know there's gonna be a lot of people watching this video that are going to want to jump down this person's throat as a possible suspect. I know in articles that I've seen he was ruled out, he's not involved, but he said that he was driving up to do something and he was actually shocked to see Amy running on this road because the area she was in, Burton Gulch, that is very far from the entrance and it wasn't paved at the time. It was a little bit difficult to get to and you didn't normally see people running out in that area. So he was first of all shocked to see that. He remembers making a joke saying that if that were him, he would be running the other direction to leave because there was a giant storm coming. And sure enough, he went up to do whatever he needed to do up this access road by Burnt Gulch. And when he finished his job, he got back in his car to go head back down. And as soon as he did that, a giant storm started. I'm talking thunder, lightning. He said that you could not even see in front of yourself when you were standing still. So he thought in his mind, oh my gosh, this girl could be out there running in this. If I see her on my way down, I'm going to offer her a ride. So his entire way down this road, he was keeping his eye out for Amy. And he said he didn't see her, but what he did see was a greenish gray van kind of pulled over on the side of the road. Now, he didn't really seem too alarmed by this, but he felt alarmed enough to say something. You know, it very well could have been someone pulled over because they couldn't see and they didn't want to drive down this road in the rain. It wasn't paved. It's very easy to have your car slip, but it also could be something very important. But what this did was prove to authorities that Amy had in fact been there. Multiple people had seen her. 10 days after Amy went missing, after still frantically searching this area, they were fairly certain she was not in this national forest. So they decided to scale back the search of the mountain, but they intensified the search for who might have done something to her. So many reports came in of odd things people heard or saw that day, all in the national forest, especially around Loop Road. There was one claim that someone heard gunshots down by Fry Lake, and then another tip came in that actually helped them finally narrow down to a suspect. So a witness called in saying she had been walking along Loop Road and that a blue truck sped past her, and it was clear that this person was like booking it. They were getting out of Dodge, and the driver was a male and the passenger was a young blonde female that she believed fit the description of Amy. And they thought they knew who fit the description of the man and the truck. And that person was Steve Bechtel. So they started to look deeply into Steve's whereabouts and behavior the day that Amy went missing. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised he wasn't one of the first people they talked to, because when it comes to spouses going missing, especially in a male-female relationship where the female goes missing, more times than not, the husband or partner has something to do with it. And usually, we all know, they're also the first ones authorities want to rule out. It's always the people closest to you that authorities want to rule out in any time of foul play. It's just like when we have a missing child, a lot of the time it's the family. You know, more often than not, the family is the one that's taken the child. But Steve really stuck to his timeline, and he said, you know, I went to Du Bois. I was 70 miles away all day long with Sam Leitner, and Sam Leitner came forward and he confirmed all of this. He said that he was with Steve that day, but there was really no proof. Sam Leitner did show authorities a receipt of gas he had gotten in Du Bois that day and the time that he got it, but again, they drove different cars. So while that did prove that Sam was there, it still didn't prove that Steve was. And the fact that they, for some reason, decided to drive 70 miles away and take separate cars instead of driving together, there was just a lot of information that they started to run into that seemed very off to them. And one of these bits of information was the 911 call, and Steve's incredibly relaxed, I guess you could say, way of handling this 911 call. So he calls in a 911 and I quote, he says, "Hey, this is Steve Bechtel calling. I'm missing a person and I'm wondering if you maybe have an extra." Clearly, you guys are probably as shaken up from that as I am, because I remember hearing him say that. I heard a replay of the 911 call and I'm hoping I can find it for you guys. It was on the documentary, so I legally can't technically take it. But he sounds totally calm and he just says it in like the most joking manner. And for someone who, according to his friends' accounts, was panicked and terrified and freaking out, but then the second they leave and he calls 911, he's making jokes, something really wasn't adding up. Authorities thought this joke was telling of his mindset and decided to bring him in for questioning. Steve came in for the interview. He sat down with the detective and the FBI agent, and they laid it out plain as day. They told him that his actions were suspicious. He was joking about his wife's disappearance. You know, he couldn't really verify his whereabouts for that day. Why would he take another car? He had access to a gun. Why did he wait till 10:30? Just all these things. And they eventually just told him that they believed that he had murdered his wife. And obviously he was shocked at this. I don't think anyone really wants to be considered a suspect, whether they're guilty or not. That's kind of something that you're like, whoa, wait a minute. But despite being told this, he still agrees to a polygraph and he was very cooperative to an extent. At some point in all this, with the FBI agent and the detective no longer just interviewing him but interrogating him, he started getting very, very agitated and eventually got up and left the interrogation, totally canceled the interview and immediately went to get a lawyer. And he called back authorities and said, "I got a lawyer, you are not to talk to me anymore, and I am not taking a polygraph." Now, I want to take this moment to kind of talk about something that I've mentioned before, and I was very naive on this when I first really started covering these cases, but I used to have this very strong thought in my head that when someone lawyers up like that and refuses to take a polygraph test, that immediately that means something is suspicious, which yes, that can be the case. However, people very often get penned for things they aren't guilty of in situations like that. You know, you want to get a lawyer. That's the smart thing to do, whether you're guilty or not, to protect yourself, to make sure you are taking the right legal steps, to make sure you're not unknowingly backing yourself in a corner, even if you are innocent completely. And when it comes to polygraphs, even if you feel the slightest bit of emotion, it can totally change the polygraph results, which can make you look guiltier. And at this point, I think Steve kind of felt like they were pushing him in a corner and they were trying to pin it on him, because I know a lot of people were very critical, and they still are so incredibly critical about him refusing to take the polygraph test, and I totally understand that. But the thing I like to do in situations like this is see both sides, and he didn't have a way to prove his alibi, and he knew that. And he had already been told flat out by an FBI agent that he had murdered his wife. So him not wanting to take a polygraph test, while yes, it is suspicious, he could have very good legal reasons to do it, because it's very easy at that point for someone to pin something on him that he didn't do. But this ended up creating a massive divide in the town. So the large climbing community really rallied around Steve and protected him, and that only made the other portion of the town even more suspicious of him. And him disagreeing to do a polygraph test, all it did was piss police off, because they were really at a dead end with their investigation, and so far the only person they were led to was Amy's husband, Steve. So they decided to get a warrant to search their home that they had been living in and search Steve's car the next day. And they searched and found no evidence of foul play in the home or in his car, but they did still find something very, very disturbing. Authorities found a set of journals that belonged to Steve, and in these journals were writings that concerned everybody. They took a deep look into these journals, and another thing that I think was kind of a misstep in law enforcement's part was that they took the journals that Steve had written and they took them to Amy's family. Now, I think this was a bad move. I think that when you are doing an investigation, you've got to look at things in a very unbiased way. And maybe the Disappear documentary didn't necessarily word things properly, and that's why it's a little off to me. But according to the Disappear documentary and what the police and detectives themselves said, they found these notebooks, they directly took them to Amy's family and told Amy's family to decipher them. Now, to me, that is just kind of handing Amy's family ammunition, because at this point, everyone's well aware that Steve is a suspect in this case, and authorities think Steve killed her. So to me, that totally takes any chance of a clear view at everything away, and it is now so incredibly biased. Now again, maybe they did more with it. I just don't like the way the Disappeared episode kind of portrayed that. But either way, these journals are explained to be chronologically ordered writings that spoke on male dominance and violent acts towards women, especially Amy. Now, they haven't released any of these writings out to the public, so we have absolutely no idea what they say. But according to everyone who read them, especially Amy's family, they know for a fact it was directed to her. And they were so disturbing and terrifying that when you read them, you just could not believe anyone in their right mind would write something like that. But then Steve, of course, always had an answer, and he went to media to air it out. So Steve basically said in an interview that these were not current writings, that this was something that he had written in high school for his high school band, and that it was, you know, random short stories that he wanted to enter into contests. Again, there's still a lot of issues with this, because who would write about violently harming a woman, even if it really was for a band, especially in high school? And you know, when someone creates writings like that, there still should be some concern that that might be how they feel. And this was my thought when I was kind of hearing all of this, you know, in the episode kind of come out. But to really stick it in more, Steve goes on to say that all these harmful, destructive, and violent acts against women that he wrote out and these song lyrics and stories, he wrote them down to get them out of his head. So he basically admitted that all these things were his fantasies and his way of getting them out of his head so he'd stop thinking about wanting to do this stuff, was to write it out. So if those urges got so bad that he needed to write them out in multiple journals, who is to say that he never did actually act them out? So authorities started asking around about Amy and Steve's relationship, and they got very different ends of the spectrum, to say the least, when it came to the answers from family and friends. So Amy's family came forward with some frightening stories. Amy had always been very independent, and you guys know that from me describing her in the beginning of this video. But when she met Steve, she started to change. They moved to Lander because that's where he wanted to move, and it's what he wanted to do. Everything they did, it was because it was his decision, even down to the most minuscule. There were points where they would go out to dinner and she wouldn't even decide for herself what she would eat. She would look to him to do it for her. And if you're not accustomed to different signs of abuse, that's a giant one. One time they were even at dinner with Amy's brother and sister-in-law, and Amy's sister-in-law noticed giant bruises covering her entire arm. And first she told Amy's brother, but then she just flat out asked Amy about it in front of Steve, in front of everybody at dinner. And they said the mood instantly got cold. Like, everything went cold, everything got tense. And Amy tried to jokingly say, oh, well, Steve gets rough sometimes, as a joke, but then Steve's response was to get up and tightly place his hands on both of her shoulders from behind her, which again, if you're not aware of abuse body language and signs of abuse, that is a control position. If it were really nothing, why wouldn't Steve have laughed it off with her? Why did he get up and then do a control sign that is specifically used to belittle someone and make them feel small and make them shut up and be quiet? It really started concerning her entire family, and they were worried there was some sort of abuse happening in this relationship, because everything Amy once was, this outspoken, independent, goal-driven young woman, seemed to have been taken away from her. But despite the family believing all this, all of Amy's friends and all of Steve's friends saw their relationship as completely idyllic. It was a great relationship. They were happy, they got along, they never seemed upset with each other, they never noticed any signs of abuse. And it's such a hard position to be in, because you never want to dismiss someone's potential cry for help or story that there might have been abuse happening. And it's very possible that her joke, Steve gets a little rough sometimes, was an underlying scream for help, because stuff like that happens all the time. But you could also explain those bruises with their lifestyle. They went rock climbing, they were outdoors all the time. Very easily those could have come from somewhere else, but if they did, why didn't she just say that? So it became this giant question mark of, was their relationship as great as some people thought it was? Did Amy's family that knew her the most catch on to something that maybe the friends didn't? Between the family's experience with Steve, paired with his writings of violence against women and the very nonchalant 911 phone call, authorities were set in stone and had pretty much made up their mind that he was guilty. But their theory really started to slowly unravel. They had no proof that Steve did anything with Amy, and they also couldn't find a motive. They didn't have a large life insurance policy, so he wouldn't really benefit monetary-wise from this situation. They seemed to be in a happy marriage according to some people, but some people also didn't think so, so they couldn't really determine any of that. And they had just bought a new home only 3 days before she disappeared. Why would he kill her to then put a financial burden on himself? But what they did have was proof that he did make phone calls at 4 p.m. at his home. So at least at 4 p.m. he was at home and he was not with Amy. And they had proof of his friends showing up at his house at 7, so he was still home then. And then the one eyewitness they had that could have placed him at the scene of a potential crime when this person saw his truck could not pick him out. So they lost the witness, they lost all these small bits of information that they were clinging on to, and there was not really much more they could do with Steve, especially since he wouldn't take a polygraph test. Steve started to realize that they were not going to move past him whatsoever because the case was sitting still. Him and a bunch of his buddies decided to continue on their own investigation. So they mailed out hundreds and hundreds of flyers, they called tons of people, they organized search parties, and they even organized a race to raise money for a reward, hoping it would bring her home. And they did raise $10,000. And despite the allegations and all the drama that had happened, all of Amy's family showed up to run in this race he had organized. But in an unexplainable turn of events, right after this race, Steve stopped talking to Amy's family and Steve completely started dismissing police. So at this point, he had taken himself out of the picture entirely. The case just stood still. There were a few leads in the next few months, but none of them panned out. One of the tips said that a few drunk drivers hit Amy, put her in their trunk, and buried her in a shallow grave on their reservation because there was tribal land in neighboring areas that she might have been in. Authorities went to the Indian Affairs Police Department to ask permission to search the tribal lands, and they were given the go-ahead, and when they went there, they searched and they even found the car they thought was possibly involved. But after widespread searches and a forensic examination of the vehicle, nothing was found. In a desperate attempt at figuring out what happened to her while she was there, they even reached out to NASA and Russia's space station. And by some insane stroke of luck, pictures had been taken of Loop Road that day at around the exact same time that she was there. So they waited for months to see if the photos would lend any clues to the investigation, but when they finally received them, cloud coverage prevented them from being beneficial. And that to me is so incredibly wild that somehow that all worked out perfectly, but for clouds to ruin it so they couldn't see anything. A big wave of publicity almost a year later resulted in hundreds of tips. Many of them were people that thought they saw Amy walking around as a homeless person in various locations across the United States. But when authorities would arrive, the person was never Amy. And then their next big break came. And this is another time where a lot of people are very critical of authorities. So a man named Dale Eaton was thought to have had some sort of involvement in the disappearance of Amy. A tip came in from Eaton's brother, and his brother basically said that Dale more than likely was involved. So having someone's brother call you and say, hey, I think my brother might have been involved in the disappearance of this girl you've been desperately searching for, you would think that people would jump on this. But unfortunately, authorities were so wrapped up in Steve that they kind of dismissed the lead a lot more than they should have. They did check into it a bit, and they blindly trusted Dale's niece that said that he was with her in Colorado, but they never actually substantiated that claim. At one point, they were even suspicious of Dale's brother because there was a gigantic reward out at this point by the FBI, I'm pretty sure. I think it was around $100,000, and they thought that this guy just wanted to be able to claim the money. But that is until Dale was arrested around a year after Amy's disappearance for another murder and a string of very horrific behavior. This man, Dale Eaton, is a piece of work. He was responsible for a murder in 1988 of 18-year-old Lisa Kimmel, also known as the Lil Miss case. And I know a lot of you probably will be familiar with that. And then on top of that, just 2 months after Amy's disappearance, he abducted a family of 2 and their baby that had been stranded on the side of the road. This story in itself is mind-blowing. He apparently drove up to this family stranded on the side of the road, and he offered to help. And when I'm pretty sure they denied it and said someone was coming, basically he put a gun to their head and made them drive. And I'm assuming he got into their vehicle from what I'm reading and understanding in the story. But this woman driving this car is smart as crap and basically turned the car after a while in a full hard circle, which allowed her husband to take the baby and jump out of this moving vehicle. And then she tried to jump out of the other side, and Dale basically put a gun to her head and almost shot her. But then the husband came behind his head and hit him in the head. And then somehow Dale ended up stabbed with his own knife, and the family safely got away. But how bad that could have been is absolutely terrifying, and the fact that they pulled off such an amazing escape in such a terrifying situation, that's crazy to me. But this still wasn't the end of the chaos that he would create. He also killed his cellmate after delivering a lethal punch to the man's vertebral artery. He clearly knew how to kill somebody. He clearly knew how to execute an abduction. And when he abducted Lisa Kimmel, he had held her captive in a bus and sexually assaulted her and then bludgeoned her to death. And then he went on to take her car and he used it as a septic tank. He even left notes on her grave, and the only reason he was caught is because handwriting was matched, this botched abduction with this family, and he had sexually assaulted her and they were able to match his DNA. And when they ended up searching his property He had clothes from other females and newspaper clippings of other females' murders. So pair that with the fact that profilers spoke to him and came out saying that man has killed more people. That was not his first kill. And authorities pretty much knew he likely was a serial killer. But because of all this information that just kind of burst out everywhere, and the fact that over this course of time, he was suspected of 9+ murders of women in different states, all in that general vicinity, authorities were finally like, oh crap, wait a minute, maybe we missed something. So it turned out his brother knew that Dale was camping in Burton Gulch when Amy disappeared. The fact that authorities could have been told that information before and maybe acted up on it, and it not only could have possibly solved Amy's disappearance, but stopped this family from almost being abducted and being traumatized for the rest of their life, is so frustrating and mind-blowing. The authorities were still questioning the brother, as they totally should. You know, the Burton Gulch was not a place that you would go camping. You know, it was a Burton Gulch. Like, that's why it had that nickname. That wasn't even the name of the place. I think technically Burton Gulch is named Access Road number 300 and something, and it wasn't the most pleasant of land. So they questioned why he would have been there if there had been so many other campsites that were much nicer. And Dale told him, you know, our family always went there. We went hunting in this area, elk hunting. We went fishing in this area. It wasn't the most ideal when it came to nice camping, but when it came to their activities, they went there all the time. And he really proved this by being able to describe the entire location perfectly. So authorities are finally like, crap. And then they really put together where this location was that Dale's brother was describing, and it was only 1 mile away from where Amy's car was found. So Dale had the capability of killing. He had proved that. He had at this point killed 2 people that they knew of and tried to abduct an entire family, and according to experts, had likely killed many more and could potentially be linked to 9 people. So it's very well established that Dale is capable of killing. But he had also been in the area and was heavily involved in crimes of opportunity, but they have yet to be able to connect him. After over a year of still no answers, authorities decided to go back where they started, near Burnt Gulch, near Fry Lake, and try to find Amy's remains. They searched the entire area. They brought in divers to search all of Fry Lake, where the end of Amy's race was supposed to be and where those gunshots were supposedly heard, but they found nothing. All these searches just kept pulling up nothing. And then unfortunately, shortly after, her father passed away without ever knowing where his daughter was and without getting any sort of answer. Everyone was just torn apart because all of Amy's family couldn't understand why Steve wouldn't take a polygraph test, and that's entirely understandable. It seemed like the one person that might have had answers just stopped being cooperative, and it was to the point where even people on these different, news outlets and, hosts of shows were reaching out publicly on their show saying, Steve, freaking take a polygraph test. Like, that's all it takes. And authorities were frustrated because they really hit a dead end with him and they weren't able to rule him out, and it was preventing them from doing a whole lot. In 2004, Steve decided to declare Amy legally dead. And this is another thing that has been very highly ridiculed, and understandably, because why else would you really want to declare someone dead unless you wanted them to be forgotten about and you were guilty of something? So a whole portion of the community was assuming that, and then a whole other portion of the community thought maybe he just needed to be able to move on. And sure enough, he did, because in that same year he remarried and then went on to have 2 children and lived in the exact same house that he was supposed to live in with Amy. Even in 2007, 10 years later, authorities said in their minds there was only one person that they wanted to talk to, and that person was Steve. So 10 years later, authorities were still going strong. In 2010, the FBI and detectives went to where Dale was imprisoned in hopes for answers, but in his own separate trial, they had taken the death penalty off the table and he was just in prison for life plus 50 years. So without that there, they didn't have much leverage, and he wouldn't answer about anything. They went back and searched Lucky Lane, which is the road where Amy and Steve had lived together. They went back with cadaver dogs and forensically tested everything and still found no clue. And they even followed up on a tip that Steve had buried Amy underneath the driveway of their new home they were supposed to move into before the concrete had set. And they went and they looked, but they found nothing. To this day, also, Steve's friend Sam Leitner sticks to being his alibi. You know, he's come forward and done interviews about this, and he said that him and Steve didn't have the best relationship, that they fought all the time, that just before this disappearance, they had gone to Australia to climb together, and they got in such a bad argument that Sam decided to leave early. And he said, you know, he was closer friends to Amy than Steve, and his exact words were, "I'm not going to cover for somebody that might have killed my friend." Since then, not much at all has happened with this case. I do want to say that if you want a very super in detail look into this case, I suggest you go listen to the Frozen Truth podcast. Unfortunately, I can only go into so much information in my videos with the time that I'm kind of allowed here before you guys like doze off. So they have multiple different episodes on her disappearance, and they're really able to dive deep into very small theories and ideas and bits of information. I know they go a lot into the location where she disappeared. They've had a ton of people from the area send them in photos, some of which I've used in this video, but they also talk about apparently some random places that cadaver dogs have hit in the location for years afterwards. They also talk about a pen that was found. I've yet to personally find any information of that online. I don't know where the cadaver dogs have hit, and I'm assuming the pen that they found was maybe thought to have belonged to her. Maybe that's what she was using to write her to-do list. They talk about the location all that stuff was. So if you want a super in detailed look into it, definitely go and check out their podcast. I think they planned on like 8 episodes, but I don't think it quite made it to that many. But now we're really kind of onto theories, and there's 2 large theories here. Obviously, that Steve was involved in some way, shape, or form. So do we believe his alibi, and maybe he really did just have no way to prove it, but he was there? You know, even so, the area where Amy went running was 20 miles away, and he was home at 4:30 but wasn't seen again until 7, that we know of. There could be plenty that authorities are holding to themselves. But, you know, did he go and look for her? We know that he knew where she was because he said she had planned on going running. He knew she had errands to do. He knew about this 10K. And his friends immediately went to Shoshone National Forest. So it's like they knew where she was supposed to be. So would he have had time to go and attack her? His car and home was searched forensically and nothing was found. And there was no sign of a struggle. So how would he have attacked her? You know, obviously there is a chance there could be no blood, but how high is the chance that he attacked her and there was no sign of a struggle? And then how high is the chance that he could have gone out there and found her on this 6-mile trek that she was planning on taking? I feel like it would require a lot of time and planning out, and it would have to be like a perfect circumstance and situation where he could have gotten out there in a certain amount of time, you know, unless his alibi is all a fake. You know, there's just nothing really proved in his situation that significantly points to him being guilty or significantly points to him being innocent. It's just in this giant limbo. So I'm very interested to see what you guys have to say about it. He could have gone there earlier and maybe found her, but you know, wouldn't there be a trace of something in his car? Wouldn't they have found her somewhere? He would have had to transport her somehow if he hurt her for her to not have been found on all of that land. It's just, I don't know. It's something that you can really end up digging so deep into with all the different theories when it comes to how he could have harmed her. The next theory is obviously that Dale was involved, and we already know for a fact what he's capable of, clearly. He also was reported by his brother years before he was even a known murderer. So it makes me question what his brother might know about just anything in general. Like, does this run in the family? Does he know more about his brother's doings than what he's letting on to? Because you don't just accuse your sibling of murder or involvement in a disappearance if you don't have a pretty dang good reason to do it. Granted, they could have had a terrible relationship, and maybe this guy really did just want the money. But I would lean towards that being more believable had Dale not gone on to do every single thing that his brother had accused him of years before he did any of it or had been linked yet. So I think for sure there's a possibility here, and I think his brother could have way more information than he's saying, could possibly be involved. There's something very strange going on with that, and unfortunately getting it out of Dale at this point is going to be not very likely. But what I will say for this theory is that Dale seemed to keep his own little prize and reward after committing these heinous crimes. And I know a lot of that is what led them to this total of 9 list of women that they think he has killed, but there's no way to technically prove it. So I'm sure if he did do something to her, he would have kept something somewhere, especially for a case that blew up this huge. He would have been very proud of that. So if they found something like that, I would completely think it's a possibility, but as of right now, it's just kind of this toss-up between these two theories. Because all in all, this to me seems like a crime of opportunity. She wasn't even sure that she would make it for a run that day. And it's very possible that she never actually told anyone she was for sure going on a run. So for anyone to really plan this, other than her husband, would be very, very difficult. I think it's highly possible that maybe she went for this run, and when the downpour happened, it's likely she was either by a campsite or potentially remembered being by a campsite. And I think it's possible that she maybe went there for shelter and she could have run into the wrong person. You never know who you're gonna run into in a space like that. When you're vulnerable, could it have been Dale? Very possibly. But also his campsite that he apparently had was only a mile away from her car, and being a runner, I almost feel like she probably would have just run to her car at that point because she was very shy, and the chance that she would walk up to a stranger and say, hey, it's pouring, can I come hop in your tent, just doesn't seem very likely to me. Another possibility I was thinking of is that maybe she decided last minute to change the route of the course. Maybe she wasn't happy with the original one. Maybe she ran it, wasn't pleased with it, and decided to try to quickly go find another one while she still had daylight. And what if she was running in an opposite direction? And that could be 6 miles in the wrong direction, and an area where maybe they didn't search. He was a long distance runner. There is no telling how far she might have run in the wrong direction, trying to maybe look for a better place for this course to go. And if they were assuming she was just in this one very specific area, she very well might not have been, and they could have been searching in the wrong place this entire time. So I feel like there's so many different theories at play here. I feel like both Dale and Steve have kind of set themselves up to looking incredibly guilty, and I'm interested to see what you guys think about this. Do you think that one of these theories is spot on, that either Steve or Dale was responsible, or do you think somehow another person came into the equation here? Do you think there is a reason why nothing was found in this area? Was she taken somewhere else? Did someone else take her by car? Why was her wallet there? She wouldn't have gone running with her wallet in her pocket. So was this a murder slash robbery motive? It's just, you could go on for days and days and days about this case on the different theories. So I can't wait to see what you guys have to say. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for listening to Amy's story this week. I appreciate it, and I know keeping her story alive is something that's incredibly important, so that hopefully eventually this is solved, because this has wrecked so many people's lives. And my heart absolutely aches for her mother and her brother and her sisters, and the fact that her father had to pass away without knowing what happened to his daughter. I could not even imagine. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and hit the subscribe button to become a part of the Hallan fam, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.